Welcome to Spotlight on Schools. We focus on the Rochester City Schools. I'm your host, Jim Strauss. Welcome to part 2 of a program involving Great Schools for All and the Rochester City School Districts. My guests today are Don Pryor and Mark Hare of Great Schools for All, and Willa Powell, the Rochester City School District. She's a board member. We talked in our last episode about what a breakthrough school was. Great Schools for All has proposed breakthrough schools between the city school district and the suburbs. What's a breakthrough school? It's a network of cross-district primary and secondary magnet schools in Monroe County, offering thematic programming that no single district can afford to offer on its own. Enrollment in breakthrough schools would be voluntary. Each school would be socioeconomically diverse with a cap on the number of poor students in any one school. Several potential breakthrough school operators are already developing plans for magnet schools in Monroe County. I read this from What's a Breakthrough School? It's on the Great Schools for All website, gs4a.org. Lots of information there. I want to direct my first question, though, to Willa Powell. Willa, your connection with Great Schools for All began, I believe, when you attended one of their events. Can you tell us what drew you to that meeting and how your involvement developed?
Well, actually, my first understanding of Great Schools for All was when Mark and Don asked to meet with me and bring me up to speed on what their group had been talking about. But I had already been familiar with some of the work they had done, including the trip to Raleigh, because some other members of their group had come to the board business meetings and spoken about their trip and asked us to be open to this idea.
Mm-hmm. So you were open to the idea. Did they zero in on you?
I don't think they did, actually. I think their first presentation was to the Excellence in Student Achievement Committee, of which I am not a member, but they sort of vetted their whole scheme to the committee members, of which there are 3, plus our board president. There was some pushback, but not all of it bad. Some of that pushback was just, answer more questions for us. Mm-hmm. Not that they weren't open to the idea, but that they wanted to hear more on the research. Mm-hmm. So there was already an interest, but maybe no one willing to take the tip of the spear. Oh. Now, I had been the sponsor for our managed choice policy, which currently allows for parents to choose among the schools within our zone and still be in the city public schools, not restricting parent choices only to parochial schools, charter schools, but to allow parents to choose from elementary schools within their zone. So I was already open to that. I'd already been familiar with Raleigh, North Carolina, because one of our consultants, Michael Alves, who helped us through the managed choice policy, had talked to me about how Raleigh used this thing called zoneless choice. So all anyone had to say was Raleigh, and I already had one ear tuned.
Okay. Don sent me an email when I asked what your involvement was, because you were on vacation. I couldn't ask you. He said that you helped them draft the resolution.
Yeah. Well, the original resolution, essentially all of the reasons for why we should do this were very well spelled out by the Great Schools for All folk. The place where I sort of gave it a left turn was in putting the school board at the head of this effort. The school board needs to declare its interest and its support for it before the administration will follow. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially my argument was, let's make sure the world knows this board is in support of it. Let's make sure that we advocate at the state level for legislation that will enable it. There are a lot of barriers right now that would make it difficult at best to achieve what we're trying to achieve.
Okay, now you do have some strategies, though, as to where to go and to how to proceed, and we'll talk about that. You have been designated, so I'm told, you've been designated to represent the district in initial meetings with suburban districts.
Right.
Have you begun that process?
Well, the closest I've come is had a casual conversation with Dan White, who is the superintendent of our Monroe BOCES. He's proposed a particular magnet program that he has in mind. The reason that I was assigned as essentially the liaison is that we are at a critical juncture in our district's internal workings, and our superintendent is fully committed to her 30,000 voices outreach campaign and her path forward vision. And so the administration doesn't have as much time for these preliminary conversations as we would like. And so, very often boards of education get in the way of superintendents' work. Here's a case where we said, how can we help? How can we help engage the community and do some of the work of that, public engagement, public relations that you simply don't have the resources to do?
Going back to the resolution, the board voted 5-0 with 2 absent on June 27th to approve that resolution. Here's what it stated according to an article by Jen Paggi on the website, GS4A. It commits the district to working with willing suburban partners to investigate the development of regional magnet-type schools that would offer students the well-known advantages of a truly diverse education.
It's very lofty goals.
Why not?
And it may be worth saying here, Jim, that as we were having the conversations that Willa referred to with her and other board members, we've also been talking with suburban superintendents, and she mentioned Dan White and also Joanne Antonacci of the 2 BOCES superintendents, and so our hope is to bring the city and the suburban districts together. Basically, the suburban district said, we're open if the city is to this, and the city has said, obviously, now that it is open and willing to take leadership around this. So I think the next step is to bring the 2 groups together. We're having continuing conversations, including one tomorrow with Willa, about how we proceed with next steps so that we can bring the parties together and really start these conversations.
Okay, well, we're out of time for this segment, so we're going to come back and we're going to look at a little more closely at the Breakthrough Schools model. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. We're talking with Don Pryor and Mark Hare of Great Schools for All and Willa Powell of the Rochester City School District. We're going to talk about the model for breakthrough schools. First of all, there are several types that it could be. We talked about magnet school set up either in primary or secondary level. There are several other forms that it could take. Mark, I think you were going to answer this question.
So, just to kind of set the table a little bit for this, when we started to draft this proposal for breakthrough schools, the goal is to figure out what are the kinds of things that could happen that would allow school districts in the county to collaborate, to offer programs and schools together jointly that could be deliberately, intentionally integrated. So the first example is what we mostly talk about, which are magnet schools, which could be elementary or secondary and could be operated by one or several school districts and open to students from around the county. The second type would be interdistrict partnerships. So let's say that just the city and West Irondequoit wanted to partner on a school and wanted to try to make that school intentionally diverse. That could be a model that could work. They could set about doing that. Receivership schools, there are a lot of schools that kind of wind up going into receivership if they can't be turned around with existing programs. So is it possible under the law, is it possible, or could it be possible under the law to say that the receivers are going to open these schools with the intention of making them interdistrict schools? That's a little tricky, but we're suggesting maybe it ought to at least be considered. Is there a way to do that? Or would it require legislation? Could we get that? And the fourth example we've usually talked about are diverse charter schools. So we don't normally support charter schools as a general principle. We don't think it gets us to where we want to get to, but let's say that you were allowed to open charter schools in Monroe County or anywhere else in New York State that were, as we say, intentionally diverse, that were set up to attract students from multiple districts with the intention of making it socioeconomically diverse, and then using this as a model for other programs that could be replicated. We'd certainly be open to having that conversation. It's pretty difficult, if not impossible, in New York State right now, given charter law in New York State, for this to happen. Essentially, if you're going to start a charter school, you have to give first preference to students from within the district you're locating in. And it rarely gets to a point where you could say 50% of the kids could come from somewhere else. So it would be it would be a gamble to try to do it that way, but we're asking the question, could you change the law to permit this to happen?
One of the characteristics of a breakthrough school is that it offers a thematic programming that no other single district can afford to offer. What kinds of thematic programming have we seen typically in other types of magnet schools or breakthrough type schools?
Well, we have STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. That's STEM. And STEAM is we add the A and make it science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. There's the International Baccalaureate programs. We've got Montessori. These are programs that, Montessori and IB programs are both programs that the city school district has and some of our suburban neighbors have, but they're really quite expensive to run. So if there were a way to do cross-district collaboration, that could allow us to open up seats and make it available to more students.
Some others?
I think typically when you look around the country, the most common ones, and there's a lot of different ideas, but tend to be what Will is talking about, art schools, separate freestanding art schools, performing arts, sometimes visual arts, whatever. Language immersion is big. In Raleigh, we saw several language immersion elementary schools where they have a high population of Hispanic, usually Mexican immigrants. And interestingly enough, what's so great about those schools is that in those schools, the immigrant children become teachers. So they're immediately not seen as kind of baggage that you have to deal with in the school, but as part of the school structure and in fact as huge contributors to it. So you find a lot of English language schools, immersion schools type things going. And I think there are things called like leadership academies a lot of communities have developed. The definition is a little vague to me, but there's all kinds of things that could be there. I mean, some school districts will try to develop a public safety academy, for example, or a culinary arts school, or a medical school. I mean, there's lots of things that could be done.
One of the things that surprised us in the survey that we did was there were, I think, 60 to 65% of the parents who responded indicated that they would be interested in the possibility of some type of school that is not necessarily for college-bound kids, but that offers opportunities for apprenticeship and skilled learning kinds of things. So I thought that was interesting because it suggests that sort of our fast-track college-oriented focus, which all districts have at some level, appropriately enough, but that there also are others who aren't necessarily suited for that or best or whose skills best apply to that. So the fact that there was some significant interest in a somewhat offbeat program, but one that could meet a lot of different needs. I think that goes to the question that we talked about unique opportunities that might not otherwise exist in many of the districts.
And this is a feature where the BOCES really comes to the rescue, because BOCES has career and technical education programs. The city school district has career and technical education programs, and then they don't necessarily overlap. So there are ways that we can essentially divvy up these specialty areas and serve a greater number of students across Monroe County.
It may also be worth noting that the Magnet Schools Committee of Great Schools for All is talking about this fall having a number of community events, almost like charrettes, where you would bring people together from different segments of the community to kind of say, if you were designing a magnet school to meet your needs or your kids' needs, what would that look like? You know, what kinds of ideas would you have? So we want to not only go with some of the things that are already on the table and that others are already thinking about, but kind of push the community a little bit to say, are there some things that we haven't thought about or that would meet your needs that we ought to be exploring? So I think that may open up some ideas that none of us maybe have thought about on our own.
One of the things we talked about in between segments was the Expeditionary School, the World of Inquiry at the Rochester Museum and Science Center. What an opportunity that could be to draw people. They don't have a Museum and Science Center out in Barrington, that kind of thing.
Well, the Museum and Science Center is a charter school, but World of Inquiry is not very far away. It's an expeditionary learning model, as is our number 10 school, Walter Cooper Academy, down on Congress Avenue in the southwest.
Some ideas that we also talked about between break. These are ideas that have been discussed. They're not dead yet, you tell me. The proposed military school Van White's been talking about might draw people. The River School it sort of took a step back, but it's still alive. That kind of thing might draw people. The word photonics has been ferried about. We'll see, but that could draw people too. Okay, we are just about out of time. In the next segment, I want to talk about a blog that Mark wrote, and it had to do with Regent's policy statement, where it was kind of revolutionary. And I want to talk about that later. So please come back. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. You've been talking with Don Pryor and Mark Hare of Great Schools for All and Willa Powell, the Rochester City School District. Mark wrote a blog about a draft statement by the Regents Department of New York called Promoting Diversity, Integration in New York State. Can you tell us about that blog?
Yeah, so the Regents' draft policy statement, which is actually kind of a response to the requirements of the new Every Student Succeeds Act, the federal education law, which is the successor to No Child Left Behind. And I'm certainly not an expert on ESSA, but clearly there are some achievement goals that are spelled out in there, and the Regents have this summer been in the spring exploring ways to support policies that will, again, improve the outcomes. What's the best way to improve the odds? So I think it's kind of an important breakthrough statement for the Regents of New York. They acknowledge the research that socioeconomic diversity improves outcomes for the poorest students and benefits all students, whether they're poor or middle class or affluent. They acknowledge that. They call for that to become a part of the planning process for school districts. And at the end of the day, they recommend that there be interdistrict partnerships, that there could be regional districts created, that there could be regional schools or interdistrict schools established to meet this goal. So the policy statement doesn't spell out how that's going to happen, but we think it's a really important voice to have moving ahead and working with the state ed department, and we think this is probably, we think that the portal is open, that if we can come forward now with ideas for how do you actually make these interdistrict schools do what the Regents are proposing, we could get a listen now that we might not have gotten 5 years ago.
Okay, so some basic questions then will come up are governance and finance.
Right.
You were going to talk about that too.
So we explored we're a citizens advocacy group, a volunteer group, so we explored some possibilities for governance in particular and see where that goes in terms of financing. So we explored the existing BOCES model. Most people are familiar with that in New York. This actually does promote and provide a structure for collaboration among school districts to provide programs that districts alone can't provide. There are some problems with that legally in terms of how it would work with what we're talking about, but there's an infrastructure there. In Monroe County, we have the urban suburban program. So it's already possible for students to go back and forth among districts. There's a tuition reimbursement plan that's in place for doing that. The way urban suburban has run, it does not get you to where we're talking about. It's a completely voluntary program, as would ours be, but there's no provision that schools that accept low-income students get to a point where they are truly diverse, miss a 50-50 split or anything like that. The infrastructure's there, but it's not to where we would want it to go. So one of the reasons that we supported the resolution that Willa authored is to bring the players to the table, bring the school districts to the table to say, we think this is a good idea. What do we need to make it possible? What kind of changes in state law do we need? What waivers do we need? What regulatory relief do we need? How can this happen? How can we use the existing resources that we have to do this kind of collaboration?
In fact, Bill Calla had been talking about a regional school model for over a decade.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the biggest barriers he faces, as we've already talked about, charter schools have to draw their students using a lottery system. You can't guarantee socioeconomic diversity when you're drawing your students from a lottery, unless you can be absolutely sure that your applicant pool is economically diverse. The issues with BOCES, the city district cannot participate in BOCES. We're precluded by law from being a member of BOCES. So you can see how instantly things become very complicated, and yet BOCES is a very effective administrator of our urban suburban program, so they're already familiar to some extent with the details. What we really need to do is flesh out what all of those legislative barriers are and seek solutions. Whether if it's a regional charter school, we have to figure out how to lift that lottery requirement off for economic diversity reasons and not let any of the other charter schools off the hook and open the door that will allow them to become exclusionary. The issue of funding is complicated by the fact that the city school district is fiscally dependent but gets most of its resources from the state of New York, whereas our suburban neighbors, it's absolutely the reverse. Most of their funding comes from the local tax base. And so when we talk about, well, who owes who money if we take their kids or they take our kids, it becomes a complicated financial issue.
So it's a work in progress.
Absolutely, a lot of things to figure out.
And one of the things we've talked about doing is to, whatever comes out of this, to have it perhaps be a regional carve-out or a local Monroe County carve-out. So we aren't necessarily talking about having to change statewide legislation, but can we get exceptions? Can we get the variances that we need at just the local level and then kind of build from there? So
Like a pilot program.
Yes, yeah.
Well, one of the things I saw on your proposal is, maybe this is pie in the sky, but an Office of Breakthrough Schools at the state level. That's one solution that would be really nice, wouldn't it? Well,
If they had the authority to
we'll see.
grant waivers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the key.
okay. Well, I want to change gears a bit. The Breakthrough Schools document states that integration, while essential, is not sufficient alone to turn around high-poverty schools. Great Schools for All supports the ongoing efforts and initiatives now occurring within the district. There's some good things happening in the district, and I want to give you this opportunity to mention a few of those.
Barbara Jean Williams, our new superintendent, has really taken an aggressive position on our path forward. She calls it path forward, and she's particularly interested in doing teacher and administrative professional development that speaks to sensitivity, adult sensitivity to the culture that our students are coming from. The students have to believe that their teachers know where they're coming from and understand them. And that means understanding the culture that they grow up in. There actually is a cultural difference with the urban poor versus, let's say, someone from Allegheny County who's, grew up poor, but grew up in the farm poor. And there's a big difference culturally speaking.
We're running short of time. Could you mention a few other things? I have a list.
Yes, please.
Well, the University of Rochester is the EPO of East High. That's an exciting experiment that's happening. This is now in its third year, as I understand it.
It's true, and if they're successful, they put themselves out of business. If they're successful,
And that's just what we want, isn't
yes,
it?
Right,
if
right,
they're
right.
successful,
Okay.
the school comes back to us at 100% control.
Yeah, Beacon School. Beacon School. It's school. Is it 33 that is the Beacon School now?
Well,
17?
this is the relationship between East High. There's a feeder pattern between School 33 and East High that is designed to promote a relationship. Gets back to that culture of a relationship with the parents and children and teachers at School 33 as they move into East High. Then there's the School 17. It's an effort to strengthen the neighborhood focus of the school, to really try to draw more from the neighborhood than our other. We do have an all-choice system. Families can choose to go to 17 if they live next door. They can choose not to. In the case of 17, the goal is to really encourage families to choose School 17 if they live in that neighborhood and build a sense of ownership around that school.
Okay.
And I think it's important to just say that Great Schools is very supportive of a lot of these things that Willa talks about, the superintendent's new initiatives, neighborhood schools, and so on. We believe it's a both the kinds of broad community-based things that we're talking about, as well as many of the things, the internal things that the district is working on now. There's no one silver bullet here, but it's many different things that need to come together.
Okay, well, we're about out of time. One last thing, though. Willa, if anybody who's watching this program, what can they do to further what's been happening, what we've been talking about?
Well, I have mentioned or alluded to Superintendent Dean Williams' 30,000 Voices outreach campaign. She's taking her staff out to public meetings to gather input, charrettes, something very much like what Don mentioned, to help get the community to wrap their brains around what the future of our district needs to be and give us input to that. So if you're a supporter of Great Schools for All and this agenda, come out to her published meetings, neighborhood association meetings, interactions with our city and county government, and put in a good word for Great Schools for All.
Okay. If people want to get involved in Great Schools for All.
Well, you can go to our website and find some information there. But I would suggest also, well, shameless promotion here, we're doing I think a big community event on the night of October 26th, and you can find information about that on the website as well. But New York Times Magazine writer Nicole Hannah-Jones is going to be with us. She has a fascinating story herself about diversity. She is an expert on diverse schools and what it takes and what are the obstacles and how do you do this. And she'll be talking at Third Presbyterian Church at 7 o'clock, and you can get all the information you need about Great Schools there and how to sign up for other things. So,
What date?
October 26th.
Now it's free, but you got to register, so which I've done. Okay, I want to thank my guests, Don Pryor and Mark Hare from Great Schools for All. Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you.
Will,
Thank
it's
you,
good
Jim.
to see you again.
Thank you.
We'll be watching what happens, and you can watch this and other episodes of Spotlight on Schools on our website at spotlightonschools.wordpress.com or on our YouTube channel at Spotlight on Schools Rochester. Thank you for watching. Good night.